Without getting too political, though, I do think that there is a sense of this book trying to capture a simpler time. And I like that the writing style also supports this in the sense that it is slow and meandering and languid, and it does not feel like Gay is trying to rush you to any kind of resolution, but rather that he's trying to take you on a pleasant and somewhat aimless stroll through a time and place that doesn't really exist anymore. This is Provinces of Night by William Gay. This book is so under-loved and under-talked about, and I honestly am surprised that it is not more popular or that more people are not discovering it and reading it. I don't think it's a perfect book necessarily. I think there are some inconsistencies with Gay's particular style of writing, and I think he's not necessarily polished to the point that some of the more well-known authors of the kind of mid-century American realists are, but that doesn't detract from the fact that he is still an incredibly accomplished writer who is not only great on a sentence level, but also has an amazing capacity for creating imagery and for creating symmetry in his writing, for developing rich characters, for immersing you in a world, and imbuing his writing with a very specific and particular feeling. William Gay was a writer from Tennessee who worked in obscurity through most of his life. He was writing alongside his day job for many years. He didn't get published until later in his life. I believe he was in his late 40s or early 50s when he first started publishing his writing. But he was writing the entire time up to that. And even after he started publishing, he did not get nearly as much attention or praise as a lot of his contemporaries. Provinces of Night came out in 2001. It's not his most famous novel. I think that would probably be Twilight, which was famously reviewed and loved by Stephen King. The book essentially follows one family and one community in rural Tennessee over a short period of time, with a particular focus on Fleming Bloodworth, who is the grandson of the famously violent and reckless E.F. Bloodworth, who used to live in the community but escaped to go and play banjo music many, many years ago. It's one of those books that feels a little bit aimless and plotless. There's not a big driving central story engine here, which is something that I personally love as long as the atmosphere is high and as long as there are other things like character development and individual moments and scenes and interactions that are keeping me engaged, which is certainly the case with this book. The story jumps back and forth between different perspectives. So sometimes we're spending time with Fleming's father, who has also run away. Sometimes we're spending time with E.F. Bloodworth, and some of the time is spent with Fleming's uncles or other characters who are living and working in the community. I think it is a little bit challenging to talk about the content of this book without giving it away because it is so aimless and there isn't really that much of a plot here outside of, let's say, one romantic entanglement that Fleming gets involved in and the central element of E.F. Bloodworth, the grandfather, coming back to the town after being gone for many, many decades, and the impact that this has not only on Fleming, but also on Fleming's uncles, Fleming's father, and the community at large. Part of the reason I love this book so much is because it reminds me of something like The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers, in the sense that you are essentially floating along inside of the world while things are happening to these characters from a very observational point of view. And one of the things that I think William Gay does very, very well as a writer from a prose and style perspective is to not over-explain anything. He uses a style of writing that sometimes reminds me of Denis Johnson or maybe Flannery O'Connor even, where the level of interiority is a little bit diminished, so you don't always know exactly what every character is thinking about or reflecting on necessarily, but you do get to experience the actions that they participate in and then their reactions to that. And what this technique does is to create a sense of mystery that is imbued throughout the entire novel. It also makes the writing feel really immersive and realistic in the sense that you do not feel like a writer is trying to tell you something about the world, but rather that you are coexisting inside the perspective of whichever character is carrying that part of the narrative. This is one of those things that I'm trying to articulate as well as I can, and increasingly getting closer, but I still haven't quite figured it out yet. And I think it's partially because it's something I'm starting to pay closer attention to in all of the reading that I'm doing, and also paying closer attention to in the writing that I'm doing. But I don't know that I've necessarily hit the nail on the head yet or found exactly what it is that I'm describing in order to be able to then articulate it as clearly as possible. If somebody out there has a better way to explain what I'm trying to get across, please let me know, because this is one of those little earworms of craft that has been digging itself inside my brain for several months, and I'm really curious and anxious to explore it further. Outside of this technique of creating some narrative distance and kind of immersing yourself in the immediate perspective of the characters, Gay's writing is reminiscent of some of the other writers that are, let's say, a little bit more well-known from the era of mid-century contemporary literature coming out of the Americas. I would say in particular he's often compared to Cormac McCarthy, and you can definitely tell that there are some moments where he is putting on his McCarthy glove and writing in a way that feels a little bit reminiscent of McCarthy, or at least is borrowing some of the textural language that McCarthy is so famous for. He's quite figurative and quite poetic, and he loves to use description. And I think it actually took me a little bit of time to get used to his style of writing, because even though it is sparse in some ways, at least in the sense of how much interior information he provides, it's also quite eloquent, and he does not necessarily hold back when it comes to describing environments, describing people, describing moods and spaces. You really get a visceral and tangible sense of the world here in this book through Gay's descriptions. And that's part of the reason I love it too, is because you feel like you are existing in this hazy, dusty, rural community that is somehow in between the modern age and the Wild West. And I think maybe what Gay does best of all, which is the lasting impression that I have from this book more than anything else actually, is the creation of really memorable imagery. He has this knack for landing you in a particular scene or visual that feels totally burned into your memory. And there's all kinds of them from this book that I still think about actually and kind of reflect on. Some of them are totally tangential and were just kind of randomly mentioned in passing, but the imagery is so sharp that you can't help but remember it. For example, at some point, E.F. Bloodworth, the grandfather, is telling a story and reminiscing about the distant past, and he's talking about a storm that happened and how when the storm occurred, he was looking out the window in the middle of the night and he saw that his barn was destroyed by the storm, and his horse, who was in the barn, had a beam stuck inside of its forehead, and when he looked at it, he thought that there was a unicorn in the lightning storm. That right there is an example of something that's totally insignificant when it comes to the theme or the plot of the book. But it's the kind of visual writing that creates memorability and makes me feel an additional level of engagement with the text, and also just has kind of a standalone poetic value to it, where you look back on the reading that you've done, and in particular when you read something like this, you look back on the experience of digesting a novel, and what's left in your brain is a series of images that feel unforgettable. And that's the kind of thing that I would really like to do in my own writing more and more as well. Gay incorporates this other technique which I find really fascinating, and I'm trying to study and understand in a little bit more detail, which is to create symmetry in the events that happen to his characters. So, for example, at the beginning of the novel, something will happen to one of the characters, and then 3/4 of the way through or near the end, something very similar will happen to them in a different context, but it has this mirror quality to it. He kind of does this over and over again, and I find it so compelling because it not only creates a sense of balance in the prose and the story, it feels like there's a thread and a connection that runs beneath the entire novel. It also gives it this sense of inevitability where you come to the second iteration of a particular symmetrical event and part of you remembers or has a sense of where this might be going because of what happened in that first one. And I'm not sure that I've necessarily seen that used to the same degree in anyone else's writing before. I am curious if it's something he does in other books as well. I have a copy of Twilight by William Gay, which I'm hoping to read in the coming weeks, so I'll do a little bit more investigation there, but it's a big part of the reason why I loved Provinces of Night so much. There's a bunch of examples of this, but I'll share my favorite one because I still think about it all the time, actually, and it's just delicious and fantastic. There's a character in the book named Albright who is maybe a little bit of comic relief. He's kind of a klutz and a dunce and a fuck up, like many of the characters in the book, actually. But he is in particular somebody who tends to be failing upward. And there's a moment earlier on in the book when he's asked by a woman in the community to come and paint her house. So he goes over there because he's desperate for money, and he paints her house. And afterwards, he asks for payment, and she says, "Oh no, I don't have any money, but you can take this pig." I'm trying to think about how to talk about this without spoiling too much. Later in the book, he is invited by another woman to paint another house, and he is paid in a different way. But there is a sense of symmetry there, and also a pretty deep level of symbolism, which I don't want to ruin if you haven't read this, because I really, really think you should read this. Suffice to say that it's pretty sublime, and I'll leave it at that, I guess. There's one other thematic element here that tends to take a backseat through most of the book, but the way that the book ends makes it feel like maybe one of the central parts. And I'm curious if it will feel like it exists a little bit more on the surface when I get around to rereading this, but it has to do with the encroachment of civilization and industry. There is a part of the town that is being dug up in order to make a reservoir or some kind of man-made lake. And you get the impression, sprinkled throughout the book, not in a heavy-handed way, that this town where these Bloodworths are living and all of the people in their vicinity is kind of a last dying bastion of a particular way of life. And I think that's part of the reason I love this book too, because it feels like a little bit of a eulogy to this particular time and place in American history. And it's not necessarily a time or a place that I have any personal relationship to, but it is romantic to me in some ways. And I think outside of the context of it being American, it's also an analogy for the changes that happened to a lot of the developed world in the late 20th century, and this movement away from community and small towns and some of the lawless Wild West mentality that seems to have been more prevalent prior to the age of the internet and mass surveillance and all of the other wonderful, lovely, beautiful things that we now take as normal in our lives. Without getting too political, though, I do think that there is a sense of this book trying to capture a simpler time. And I like that the writing style also supports this in the sense that it is slow and meandering and languid, and it does not feel like Gay is trying to rush you to any kind of resolution, but rather that he's trying to take you on a pleasant and somewhat aimless stroll through a time and place that doesn't really exist anymore. I had a really hard time finding interviews with William Gay. I did end up finding a podcast, which I will link below, which is an interview with two of his contemporaries and friends, which was recorded after his passing. But they are talking a little bit more about his life and his work, which is quite instructive and valuable to listen to if you're a fan of Provinces of Night or any of his other writing. I did also find one maybe 5 or 6 minute interview that was conducted with him at some point while he was alive. It's really short, but it's also really fantastic and almost maybe better because it's short. I will link that down below as well. For some further reading and reference material, the first book that I would point you towards is Hard Rain Falling by Don Carpenter. This is another example of a book that I think is really underrated and underloved. I think it kind of got lost in obscurity for many, many years. It was written in the 70s or the 80s, I believe, but has recently been republished and had a little bit of a second life thanks to some booktubers who have discovered it and some people who are starting to talk about it and share it again. This obviously is an NYRB repress. I'm really glad that the NYRB is doing stuff like this because this book deserves a lot of love and attention. It's similar to Provinces of Night in some ways, especially when it comes to thematic material. I think both stories are kind of focused on the melancholy and aimlessness that young men feel, and both of them also are dealing with kind of a way of life that feels antiquated and maybe not existent anymore. Carpenter's book is a lot more about crime and prison and kind of the rough side of life that the protagonist Jack falls into, but it is fantastically written. The prose is really unbelievable, and I think it's one of my favorite prison stories ever told. And I think if you're a fan of Americana in general and the kind of down and out storytelling from that time period, then this is probably something you would like. Denis Johnson, Train Dreams. This is another one that I put in the same category as Provinces of Night. I'm trying to find the best descriptor. I think I'm doing a disservice to all of these books when I just call them Americana, but so much of the stories in all three, Don Carpenter's Hard Rain Falling, William Gay's Provinces of Night, and Denis Johnson's Train Dreams, has a similar quality of melancholy in it, and also share a quality of being unsentimental, which maybe is a better way to describe the thread between them. I think I also tend to gravitate towards writing that has to do with characters who are wandering souls, and all three of these books have that as well. Train Dreams obviously is something that I think is getting a lot of attention right now and being talked about quite a lot. Deservedly so. It's an amazing novella. It's also something you can read relatively quickly, so would recommend this if you're into Provinces of Night. I'm also pulling up Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I'm a big Steinbeck fan, as many people are. Steinbeck is kind of the originator of a lot of the sensibilities of the writers that I previously talked about and mentioned in this video. Obviously, I think the one that gets the most attention these days is East of Eden, which is also a phenomenal book. But for me, Grapes of Wrath feels a little bit more similar to Provinces of Night in the sense that it has to do with working class people and rural communities, and also the persistence of the human spirit. In addition, Grapes of Wrath has one of the most fantastic ending images of any book I've ever read, and that style of symbolic imagery reminds me a little bit of William Gay, or maybe vice versa. William Gay's use of symbolism reminds me of Steinbeck, but either way, there's definitely a connection there. Lonesome Dove is another one that I see a connection to. Obviously, this book is very beloved, and deservedly so, because the character development and the world building and the emotional through lines here are really unforgettable. Regardless of whether or not you're a fan of Westerns and American culture in general, I think the reason I'm pointing to it coming from Provinces of Night is because both of them have this slightly Western, rural, Southern quality to them. This one obviously takes place a little bit further back in American history. It's a little bit more epic. It's more plot-driven. It's more rich in a lot of ways as well. But if you've never read it, then definitely check it out. That's it.